Hey, what's up, Street Tall? It's Eric from the Eric Street Photography blog. I got a lot of ideas and feedback from a lot of you guys, and one of the ideas was to do a technical video on the best settings for my current favorite digital camera, the Ricoh GR version 2. It's pretty much the same thing as the Ricoh GR version 1, except it has like Wi-Fi and some other new effects, but it's pretty much the same thing. But hopefully in this video, I'll just show you guys some basic tips and tricks in terms of things which I do. First things first. One thing I'd recommend is going inside the menu and seeing if you have your camera set up, a certain way. So generally for the picture format, I recommend using RAW plus JPEG. And what that means is, you're shooting a RAW image plus a large JPEG. The reason which I like this is because sometimes the JPEGs look better than the RAW images. And it's kind of nice to have both. And nowadays, because hard drives are so cheap, there's not really a reason why not to shoot both. It does make the shooting a little bit slower and adds a little bit to the buffer, meaning if you click a few times, it takes longer for your LCD screen to show up. But, I think the payoff is worth it. And so for the effect, this could be anything you want it. Usually I have it stuck to high contrast black and white mode, which kind of gives you this really high contrast black and white mode, which is pretty cool. Cross process mode, which adds some funky colors, or positive film, which looks pretty default. And if you ever wanted to change some of the settings, I believe in the Ricoh version 2, you could just press the FN2 button, and then you can adjust the saturation, contrast, as well as sharpness. The defaults I usually have like 5, a little more contrast and sharpness. And so going back to the menu. And also this is one thing that I personally do when I'm shooting with the Ricoh GR version 2. So the cool thing is you could actually create a crop mode. So by default it's a 28mm lens, but you could also shoot it at 35mm. And I currently have this mapped out to one of my function buttons. So for function F, for this function button number 2 down here, you can see by default this is the 28mm, and you can see how wide the perspective it is. But the second I press the FN button, it'll crop into a 35. And I find this often useful when you're shooting portraits where you don't want to get super close and distort people's faces with the 28. And with the 35, it kind of helps out. And I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. I'm just kind of scrolling down. All these things are pretty much normal. Let's see, I don't think I really changed any of this. ND filter, I keep that on auto. Dynamic range composition strong, meaning if there's really bright and dark, bright spots and dark spots, it kind of evens it out. I think all this stuff is pretty default. Okay, down here. So, one thing I do recommend turning on is this direct ISO control. Keep it on, and pretty much what this does is, if you want to change I'm just going to change the exposure compensation back. So if you want to change the ISO, this little dial up here, which is the ISO button, if you do this left and right, you could see how the ISO is changing. So by flicking this a little bit to the left, you could change your ISO. Sorry, my fingers are getting in the way. And this is a very useful function to have. So we'll keep that on. And you can see here, you could change the function 1 buttons, which is the left arrow here. I currently have it off. I don't use anything on it. And for function 2, you could see I have it between 28mm and 35mm. And there's tons of different settings you could do, but this is one I generally prefer. Effect button setting, which is that little button on the side. I just use that to change the JPEG filters. I believe all this, let's see. Yeah, that's all default as well. Scrolling down here, so let me just go to the top of this menu. Alright, so all this stuff is same. Volume settings, I have the sound totally off, so it doesn't make any annoying sounds. I have the auto power off at 10 minutes, which is kind of good because you don't want it to stay on too long, but not to turn off too quickly either. Sleep mode off, so the camera is pretty much always on. Let's see, what else? If auxiliary lamp, that's pretty much when it shoots that super bright green autofocusing lamp. I usually have it on, just makes autofocusing a little faster. If mode high speed, why not? I have all these other stuff off. LCD confirmation time, I turn this off because what this is every time you take a photograph, it automatically shows you the image in the LCD screen. The reason I have it off is every time I take a photo, it kind of gets you in your face, and that's pretty annoying. Also, grid guide display options. There's a rule of thirds, and there's this like diagonal one, as well as this one. I like the diagonal mode because when I'm out shooting photos, you could kind of see the diagonal grid that it adds on top of the images, which I feel like helps in composition because diagonals are a lot more dynamic than the rule of thirds. Another big thing I changed here is the display button setting. And so you can see every time you're shooting and you hit the display button, is going to change this kind of view. And currently I have it on this mode where everything is off except the grid guide. And the way you could change this on and off is you push the adjustment lever inside. So you can see it's going on and off, on and off. And you can see all these things are off except the grid guide, which means when I'm actually shooting and pressing the display mode, one of the modes is actually to turn off the LCD screen. Then there's the default mode where it shows all these additional functions and features. And then by going to the third display mode, you can see it shows nothing except the grid overlay, which just means fewer distractions when you're out shooting. Alright, so let's see. Make sure the function button settings are on. And yeah, I think all these other things here are just set to default. And personally, I don't really use Wi-Fi on this camera. I just download the JPEG images or the JPEGs and the RAWs to my hard drive. If you guys are curious too, the SD card I'm currently using is a Transcend 128 gig. It's pretty cheap on Amazon, and I've used Transcend for the last 3 years. They're cheap and they work really, really well. And yeah, 128, might as well get it. And in terms of charging, I don't actually take out the battery and charge it that way. I just pop open the little side here, and I charge it via that little tiny thing that kind of looks like a micro USB, and I just charge it into the wall that way, which means fewer stuff that I need to travel with. And in terms of the settings I shoot with, I currently have my camera in P mode, which means that it automatically chooses the aperture and shutter speed, and it just kind of makes life a little bit easier because I don't have to worry about constantly changing the settings. I just kind of set it and forget it. In terms of the ISO, I usually keep it around 800, and if it's really dark, 1600 or 3200. And you can also see I have a third-party LCD cover screen here. Just, I got it for like $10 on Amazon. I'm not really sure which one it is, but all of them are pretty good. And another thing that I personally changed is under the, let's see. Nope. Actually, no. That's pretty much all I do. And there's all these different camera settings you could use when it comes to setting your camera. And if you're first-time Ricoh user, if you want to change the exposure compensation, do plus and minus. Another cool way you could shoot street photography is by setting your camera to snap focus mode, which means your camera is autofocused to a certain point. And the way you could do that is under camera, the focusing settings. Multi-autofocus means it's just going to choose an autofocus whatever the camera thinks it is. I usually keep it as spot AF, which is the center point autofocus. Pinpoint AF, subject tracking, never use that stuff. Manual focus, don't really use that much either. Snap mode, which means it will automatically pre-focus to a certain distance. So you could choose 1 meter up to infinity. 1 meter is roughly 1 arm length away. And this is good if you're out shooting and people are moving and you just want to kind of capture them that way. But generally, by default, I'll keep it on spot AF, which just autofocuses to the center point, and it works pretty well. Also, if you want to focus on someone really close to you, I recommend using this macro mode here. So I could shoot really close-ups of things really close to you. And of course, if you want to use the flash, just touch that here, and then same thing. And voila. And another cool thing with the Ricoh is you can see when I push this adjust menu, you could actually change the things that appear in this menu. But I always kind of forget where it is. So let me make sure that I know exactly where that is. It's probably one of these right here. Let's see. Oh yeah, I think it's here. So under the second menu, adjust lever setting, you could choose the different settings. So I currently have it under ISO, snap focusing distance, and focus. Other things you could change are like picture size, aspect ratio, focus, exposure metering, continuous mode, auto bracket, flash comp, and a bunch of these other stuff. But I've personally found that these three things are the best for me: ISO, snap focusing distance, and focus. So once again, you could see if I push in the center button here, I could change the ISO quickly, or I could just use the little lever, pushing this a little bit to the left or to the right. I could, if I'm assuming that I'm using snap mode autofocus, which means it's pre-focusing to a certain distance, also known as hyperfocal, then I could just change the snap focusing distance from 1 meter all the way up to infinity. But once again, my default settings are spot AF, center point autofocus, and I usually keep my ISO 800 for color and the ISO 1600 and above for black and white. And so that's it. Once again, these are just some basic settings that I personally use for my Ricoh GR. There's tons of different settings you could use. I know some street photographers, you could switch your camera to aperture priority mode, stick your aperture around f8, which could be adjusted with this little dial up here. So, sticking around f8, keeping the ISO relatively high, ISO 1600 or 3200, and using snap focus to pre-focus to 1 meter, which is a good way to do street photography. Also, another cool thing is that this TAV mode, which I personally don't use, but I know a lot of other street photographers do. Essentially, what you could do is you could adjust your aperture to like f8, and you could change your shutter speed by pressing the adjust lever left and right. And once you dial in the settings, then it'll automatically choose the ISO, which means all the photos that you shoot will be at f8 at 250th of a second. But the reason I recommend shooting P mode is, once again, it's just another complication you deal with. But anyways, yeah. Sorry, this video went on a bit long, but once again, just go out with when you're shooting with the Ricoh GR, experiment with different settings, find out what works best for you. And until then, just be happy and keep shooting. Peace out.